Well, the weather's demanded that I put this in the safekeeping, and I have. Thank you all for coming and braving the weather, though, of course, you know, it's a pleasure not to be a, not a fair weather friend to Chester, and I'm glad you all could be here for this. It is a real honor, is the word I'm looking for, to be invited and asked to introduce Chester this afternoon. And I'm going to, in my capacity as arts director, occasionally I've been running things like Covey County, and occasionally I used to run the Poetry Center for a while at SUNY Stony Brook. And I am famous for my short introductions. And the reason for that is that I've learned over the years that you're not here to see me. All right? So basically we are here to celebrate the work of this incredible writer. So here's my brief introduction for Chester. There are many ways to serve poetry. There is, of course, the writing, the crafting of the thought, the image, and the words to the page. And there is the publication of it, the desire of the editor to bring the labor of the poet to the marketplace. Or the anthologist, who bundles what they consider the best of us to keep. Or places like Poet's House, a castle of stanzas that anyone can roam through. We could also include the teacher, the mentor, who tries to convey their passion into a younger version of themselves, even the coordinator of the reading series, the bookstore owner, or the critic has a hand in keeping the pulse of this art beating. J. Chester Johnson, though not unsung, is without any doubt in my mind one of those writers to whose quiet but necessary work we are here this afternoon to give a very well-deserved and well-earned hurrah. He is similar to many of the lovers of our arts in the way I've just listed, but in many ways he is in the class all to himself. As a translator, his work as a younger man with Auden on the Common Book of Prayer, a work whose DNA threads through the lines of so much of 20th and 21st century lyric, can be considered by any reasonable measure a triumph. I am not a translator, but I believe I know enough to guess that like any good piece of theater or film, everything depends on who is cast in the role. In the hands of the wrong poet, brilliance becomes slop, the fire of a line mere smolder. That Auden did not raise a concern when Chester was added to this project should tell us much about the skill set Auden must have detected in the younger poet. That young J. Chester Johnson was up to the task and did not break faith should also tell us a bit about the man as well. If J. Chester Johnson had done nothing more with his writing career than lend his poet's eye, ear, and sweat to this project, I think we all would still be sitting in this room. That reflects the size and utility of his contribution to the world of letters. But of course, there is more. There is the joy of the poet set loose in the world, the poet who reflects and questions, the poet who tests and chooses which side he is on, the poet that wrangles experience into bright human song. In one of the Psalms in the Book of Common Prayer, a book of lyric human faith, endurance, and mystery, we hear lines which, if we don't squint too hard, sound as if they could have been tweeted yesterday. You mortals, how long will you dishonor my glory? How long will you worship dumb idols and run after false gods? In J. Chester Johnson's poetry, essays, verse plays, and translation, we observe a writer who will always push his language against dishonor. He is a poet who has stirred in the raw fire of the worst of what we humans can do to each other. Murder and mayhem in the civil rights South, the perfect deadly state logic of the Nazis, and somehow pull out the hidden grace of honesty and lay it true upon a page. It is how a fine poet pays his obligations to our craft and a fine person, the world. It is an honor to introduce my friend, the poet, playwright, and translator, J. Chester Johnson.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Cornelius. Thank you for all you are, have been, will be, and in for the community of letters. I also wish to thank each of you for coming on this weatherized day, and to thank Poets House and the Arts Group of Trinity Church Wall Street, partners in the program. My wife is here, right here. I think everyone knows her. Well deserved. Marion Evans, or can everyone hear me all right? Yep. Marion Evans, or George Eliot if you prefer, wrote in Middlemarch, "Correct English is the slang of prigs who write history and essays, and the strongest slang of all is the slang of poets." Close quote. If this be true, then it would presumably make us poets the very worst of prigs. But today, you won't be hearing any poetry slang, impressionism as style, feminine or masculine rhyme, confessional or subjective verse, or the like. No siree. Not from the poetry of my book, Now and Then. Does it simply resonate? I know some of you want to hear more about Auden, and I'll go out of my way to accommodate that desire. However, I also promised to spend a few minutes on Now and Then before the focus is given over to Auden, the Psalms, and me. W.H. Auden believed there was one book a poet should never need to write, and that is an autobiography. I can't quibble with Auden on this. A poet's body of verse, instead, should serve that purpose. Now and Then, selected longer poems, is as close to an autobiography, though in verse, as I'll ever write. 9 separate pieces. There is the story of Pug, an imagined conversation, with my father, whom I didn't know. There is the piece that reflects the time I left New York City to return after Martin Luther King's assassination to my Arkansas hometown along the Mississippi River Delta to teach in an all-African-American public school before integration. The book contains civil rights verse pieces, meditations on civil rights activists, and the poem, Martin. There is also the poem, I'm going to put a lozenge in my mouth. Just give me a moment. Oh. Okay. Thanks. Some folks who have been here and heard me speak know that I have to put lozenge in. It's just one of those things. I think it's a residual from 9/11. There is also the poem Exile, in verse dealing with the crucible of spiritualities, such as the poem of Time Divided, and For Conduct and Innocence, a drama in verse on Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German martyr and theologian who died at the hands of Nazis 2 weeks before liberation of the concentration camp where he was held captive. You won't hear from all of them today, but they are there. I wrote these pieces not knowing whether they would or should ever be published, some going back several decades, most packed away for years. Then the publisher of the second edition of my St. Paul's Chapel and selected shorter poems asked to publish Now and Then, and I'm so grateful to St. Joanne Press for doing this book. I think it is a beautifully presented volume. I'll read short selections of the verse, moving around in the pages of Now and Then before turning to Auden, the Psalms, and me. Let's start with a couple of selections from Meditations on Civil Rights Activists. There are more in this long poem, but today, persona pieces of 2 people you've heard less about, though both had influence on civil rights in this country. First, Ida B. Wells, born in Mississippi, a journalist who was run out of Memphis for writing an article on a local lynching. She did her work at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, documenting the lynchings of African Americans. Her work is still relied upon. I am Ida B. Wells, dear Lord, with Mississippi of my first days, Memphis of my noisy days, and Chicago of my fabled ways. I don't apologize, rarely asked for forgiveness and prized pistols and rifles for black folks to meet the guns of white devils. For resistance can beat the half-hearted. By learning to stand on my own 2 feet long ago, I spoke my mind loud and clear and spoke it well, if I do say so, surely suing the railroad when only 22 in 1884 for treating me poorly. I later covered firsthand the race massacre of Elaine, daring bullets and knives galore without a scratch. I'd see every inch straight on without amendment, since justice is justice, Lord, and I'd not flinch. I withstood wild yellow fever, though my good parents and sibling were vanquished. So don't tell me to slow down. I've seen those who utter only yes. They're the first to go, and go badly. Oh, Lord, somebody had to tell the story, and I did. When I told myself ages ago, I write what I think, with consequences uncajoled. For those of us only like that, it's no surprise. We are what we have to see. One more short excerpt from these civil rights meditations. Jonathan Daniels, a young white seminarian, went to Selma after Freedom Summer to work on education and voter registration issues. He was martyred, throwing himself in front of a shotgun blast and saving a black teenager, Ruby Sales, who has spent since then much of her life on equal justice issues. To the ground, Ruby Sales, enough is enough. You shall be safe to begin anew, a life before you and free, a life wrought of choice and space. You to forgive all to a greater love of all, for lives raised is life praised. Do not grieve for me, Ruby Sales, for sweet Jesus has borne my wounds home, and the blood of my body, the blood of Medgar, Martin, the Philadelphia Three, and all the rest have soaked the soil in the soul and saved the South and me. After MLK's murder, and I returned to Arkansas along the Mississippi River Delta to teach in the black children's public school, I dropped into the home early evening of one of my students. As I walked into the house, I noticed a distressed white man in bed in the living room, gasping for air. My student, a young girl of about 13, stood close and pointed to him, saying, "Some call him Bill, others call him the Mixer." A long poem, The Mixer, came out of that moment. Here is an excerpt. Envy admits that love was a stranger appetite with them, that she was older than most and didn't care much about men before him. Slowly astir, he wasn't interested in one or any more until they both started one fall picking the season's crops. Love would pour a secret for them who didn't talk to anyone else down a row and bent for taking fruit or vegetables. Like a gun erupting, occasionally his father's wilder voice could shatter the rows. You leave that black woman alone, or for her there will be nothing left of you. Still one afternoon, as everyone left the fields and set toward home along the jejune and dirt-dusty road, Bill and Lucy walked off together. Next morning they strolled into Reddy Rose with something steadier that had been found. He carried a lunch in a sugar sack. History has it that sometime after they moved further back into the country roads and went to town, then only to sell tomatoes at the auction. It's told that his father, pell-mell, almost killed him on a couple of nights cause of his Lucy. But that was a long time ago during planning, and no one really remembers. Two short selections from Home. The title foretells the content. I was the new revolutionary, born on the brink of dying, somewhere in an early morning at some distant place where places and times do not matter. Sunny women must have laughed and praised, some crying a bit of happiness at my coming. Congratulations were spread out around a father somewhere in a young old city by votive telegram. that carried me to him for legend's sake. I came to help and then disappear, to help who or what was wounded or wounded by ill-fated promise. I took what I was first taught could improve us, and all the rest were replays. I threw flamboyant words away, believing they limited what I meant to say. Then I talked remarkably and relied on talking, how I come to others to be closer to myself. Afterwards I dreamed nothings, and nothing came of them, proving how weak dreams are. I was born in the mountains. I was conceived in the delta. I got my training in the glory of a top sun, in mud bottoms dragged surreptitiously to famous illusion. A second selection from home. The motive of home descends upon our world and commands like a famed specter, declaring its pagan magic and occult possession. We then learn calls from another side stop a private attitude of lovers in their sea of voices, remembered, rejected, and returned. How the terror of history's increscent field restates for us those odd instructions we hope will not be retaught again. For all the ruins of intimate wars stand as recognition that nothing is more unrestrained than the unclear demands of memory. In a world without consensus, home exists only for the compelled, who attract no siren from foreign discordant gods, and whose salvation breathes in mutual approval. This selection comes from the long story poem, January the 12th, 1967, that combines fiction and some related experience. The protagonist, a young white man from a small southern town, has come to New York City to locate some former friends, fails, and finds himself at the end of one day forced into the city's underbelly at a flop house on the Lower East Side. This was 1967. The depicted episode segues into the postscript. As soon as a plank under some shoe tilts uneven, something small squeals, leaping triumphantly over a balustrade. Into the dark dimpled wood wall, an elaborate gash, and nearby a rich cracked urn can testify to the myth we all know to be true. The god of art is no match for the god of survival. Sour-laden clothes and ripened poor breaths introduce those who, gathered, claim the buried floor and roar at any intrusive cough. I begin to step over bodies, systematically inert. Someone as young as I remember I should be, and another too apart to know the crime. Postscript. It has been told as a message how loss is only a kind of prophecy, how the meaning of Vedic signs from lower events is reducible to Earth's incomplete form. For there's a mad style to it all. Irony can just as well correct the incorrigible as it can and will stifle the powerful cries of moral creatures. While we listen for common voices, we recall that distance cannot alter its distance, as our present mocks our past. Wishes defined by place, idols of parochialism dissolved, and through mist cognition rises so clearly it shines, with our recourse remote and close. A city, the hidden regions of a hamlet. A few lines from Pater Magnificus' story of Pug. My father died when I was 1, and I grew up with an idealized version about Pug, fostered by family members. Soon I set off on my own journey to find him in reality. At least now I can compare notes, and no Pug is trying to give me a straight answer. Disappearing acts are hard, I would vow, if not impossible to follow. Just ask anyone in a greater act, and they'll tell you so. and we're no exception. I longed to emulate the image you were. After such a quick exit, put a stamp, an imprint of special claws, fit upon your bones. Only later did the moist folly and darkened eye of rare success for the attempt arrive. So I quit trying, and soon left to tell of the pleasures of fleeing a common season played between unevens. And yet so I, in many respects, managed. I think by now I have become, first of all, a few moments of my own. From this bridge alone, I'm able to talk to you with mere minor discomfort, no severe slant. Only equals converse, unequals chatter. Thus we can report it's a good deal healthier now, since the lions have crawled back into their caves with no late meal. The snakes have disappeared, the ravens are silenced, and the hinges and rages of your coffin no longer screech and whine for relief from the expanse of pressure you exert to pursue an unfaithful and undutiful son. Next, two selections with a different motif from the poem Exile. Like home, a title foretells the content. Of distractions, he was, like most, fully versed, and yet he still knew a carefully arranged touch is but a transmutation of a desire to reach for rebirth. And what errors he shall commit make him more dependent on the search. Exile, now nestling in fresh suburban folly, now surveys awkward oaks, survive thousands of miles, thousands of days from a place that destines him exile. All he had or could avail out of context. To stay put, he heard clearly enough. The other, less so nominal. Deconstruct into history to be what he wasn't, but for years he believed he was meant to be. To do instead on his own, not bound by what he was born, to reach what could be done, peregrinator. Length with its quirks he seated, as exile greets a glaze rising concordantly over a set of invaded hands. Flesh wears down and starts to illume from an excessive rub independent years perform. What we were guides what we will try, and what we are will carry pieces of both. A second selection. Exile probes through another sly glance into fading autumn. He spies for one transfiguring aside. In normal times, to be normal requires give and take, and survival on each count. That's the way it shall be. Survival above all else, and only decayed amusement at the margin. Those who rely on stories have reason to travel. Those who can't travel listen and imagine to take the trip anyway. A short selection from Of Time Divided, a modern tale of Lazarus, risen from the dead. But you, Lazarus, avoiding singularity of time, you finally made it, cultural hero. There are fan clubs. You reveal sex appeal. While some flock to discern you, others fumble for an autograph. You, a scoring star. People in every city are now rushing to your next tour. They come, and some bend their taste in the angle they infer. The theater of rectitude raised to another grade. So, Lazarus, voiding singularity of time, you can now tell us, has the still separate world made this one a little less apart? Oh, thanks. The last selection comes from the poem Martin. A phalanx of angry racists raced through the hectic wound that couldn't match you, Martin, when the bullet split flesh from valves. They rushed in to collect spoils, a storehouse of colossus and message that carried a generation of both courage and advent, and to steal away across Memphis to sequester the victor's remains. Silence fell over the struggle, and lessons sighed, enough was enough. Which way you went meant the word you sent. Wisdom you infused could not be refused. Martin, you wouldn't let the dead stay dead, for they had a purpose, to show an array of reasons the past should pass away. And yet so we will learn once again, whoever kills the past, it must also kill. With that being said, let's put now and then selected poems to the side and move on to Wystan Hugh and the Psalms in my other 2017 book, Auden, the Psalms and Me, the story of the retranslation of the Psalms contained in the current Book of Common Prayer of the Episcopal Church. There's much in my book about the participation by the eminent poet W.H. Auden in this retranslation, and more broadly about his views toward the revision of the entire Book of Common Prayer of 1979. I wish to weave these three elements of the book into a coherent fabric this afternoon. As a way of background, in 1971, I replaced Auden on the drafting committee upon his decision to return to England to make Oxford his winter home after several decades of living here in the United States. Auden and I communicated through letters even after his decision, and I served as the poet on the drafting committee from 1971 until the final version of our work was published in the 1979 Book of Common Prayer. It is fair to say that Auden, in the dusk of his life, had become more than a bit occupied with the thread of revision to his beloved prayer book. For years, he heard rumors rumbling through the Episcopal Church that this revision was under serious consideration. But then in 1967, upon authorizing actions by the Episcopal Church's General Convention, Auden then knew the reality was near, despite his deep reservations about revision. It is crucial to bear in mind as we walk through this story to understand that his misgivings about the revision were not the same for the retranslation of the Psalms as they were for the rest of the Book of Common Prayer. Importantly, Auden was too much a scholar not to recognize that real problems existed with the Psalms carried in the pre-1979 prayer book. There were many mistakes in the Miles Coverdale version of the Psalms. Even such a committed Anglican as C.S. Lewis would say of Coverdale, quote, "Of course, a sound modern scholar has more Hebrew in his little finger than poor Coverdale had in his whole body." Close quote. To be more specific, the biblical scholar S.R. Driver at the very end of the 19th century stated, "The warmest admirers of Coverdale's work must allow that it is disfigured by many inaccuracies." Close quote. So it was well known for generations that the Psalms in the Book of Common Prayer were seriously flawed. In fact, the very first letter I received from Auden on the project acknowledged the need to correct Coverdale's mistranslations. This problem was not new nor surprising. After all, Coverdale knew little Hebrew and had relied on his facility with Greek, Latin, and German to render the Psalms contained in his great Bible of 1540, Psalms that Thomas Cranmer would incorporate for the very first Book of Common Prayer in 1549. Cranmer felt quite comfortable with that Bible at the time and had written the preface to it as the first Archbishop of Canterbury for the Church of England. Nonetheless, it was known that these mistakes needed to be fixed, and Auden was cognizant of that fact, although he would have a somewhat more narrow approach in the handling of Coverdale than the drafting committee held as a whole. Despite his enormous output, Auden wrote very little about Cranmer, Coverdale, and the Book of Common Prayer prior to 1967. Of course, there were references here and there, such as Perfect Freedom from the Collect for Peace that Auden inserted in his poem New Year Letter. He would also take the line, "From whom no secrets are hid," from the opening sentence of the opening collect of the 1549 communion service and insert the phrase in his poem, Secrets. He obviously carried the memory of lines from his early prayer book and the effect from both of his grandfathers being Anglican clerics. His mother, who influenced Auden more in the ways of the church than his father, was a quite devoted Anglican. And Auden himself had been a devoted choir boy. In the book A Certain World, he ascribes some of his poetic acumen to word patterns and phrases gained from his experiences as a young Anglican. Quote, "As a choir boy, I had to learn not only to sight read music, but also to enunciate words clearly, and to notice the difference between their metrical values when spoken and when sung, so that long before I took a conscious interest in poetry, I had acquired a certain sensitivity to the language which I could not have acquired in any other way." Close quote. So Auden felt he owed a great deal to the artistic language of the Book of Common Prayer. That is, the version buried deep from childhood in his memory banks. By the summer and fall of 1967, he began to turn his attention and enormous talent to the issue at hand, the proposed revision. In October of 1967, Auden gives the inaugural and commemorative T.S. Eliot Lectures at the University of Kent in Canterbury. The topic he chooses is Charles Williams' play Thomas Cranmer of Canterbury. Two excerpts from this lecture indicate the considerable thought Auden was giving to the subject astir back in the States among Episcopalians. Quote, "Those of us who are Anglicans know well that the language of the Book of Common Prayer, its extraordinary beauties of sound and rhythm, can all too easily tempt us to delight in the sheer sound without thinking about what the words mean or whether we mean them." Close quote. In the second critical excerpt, Auden puts the then current revisionist trend in the context of Thomas Cranmer more than 400 years earlier. Note particularly the word today. Quote, "Cranmer was a priest and an artist, and like all artistic priests then and today, he overestimated the spiritual importance of liturgical reform and underestimated the resistance of the uneducated laity to it." Close quote. Auden also marshaled his resources for the return to New York City. The following month back home, he attends a worship service at St. Mark's in the Bowery, his home parish, at which an experimental liturgy is being conducted by the parish priest. At the conclusion of the service, Auden fires off a smoking 4-paragraph letter to the priest, dated November the 20th, 1967, characterizing the new liturgy as appalling and emphasizing, "I implore you by the bowels of Christ to stick to Cranmer and King James." Close quote. Later, Edward Mendelsohn, Auden's literary executor and principal biographer, would send me a note and refer to this letter from Auden to his parish priest as the one that started it all. Within a month, this letter from Auden made its way to the Standing Liturgical Commission of the National Episcopal Church and to Reverend Canon Charles Gilbert, who at the time was custodian of the Book of Common Prayer, vice chairman of the Standing Liturgical Commission, and most particularly relevant, chairman of the Psalter Retranslation Committee. In a letter of response sent a few days before Christmas, Canon Gilbert invites Auden to join the Psalter Committee and proceeds to address in detail each point in Auden's letter to his priest. I won't go through Gilbert's response. However, it is curious to note that Auden immediately replies in a succinct manner, quote, "I should be honored and delighted to serve in any capacity on the Standing Liturgical Commission," close quote. This is quite telling. Canon Gilbert had not offered Auden a position on the Standing Liturgical Commission. Rather, he had been offered only a place on the Psalter Committee. But Auden knew where the power lay, for the Standing Liturgical Commission was responsible for the revision to the entire Book of Common Prayer, and that's where Auden wanted to be heard, not just at the Psalter Committee level, where his views were not so at variance with the membership. Canon Gilbert apparently never discusses with Auden the request to be appointed to the church's Standing Liturgical Commission. Auden later found that he was not able to attend all of the meetings of the drafting committee for the Psalter retranslation because of his heavy travel schedule. Also, Auden always spent April to October at his summer home in a small town outside of Vienna, Austria. However, these absences allowed Auden to communicate to Canon Gilbert through several amazing letters. I'll quote from one on March the 19th, 1968, that is quite remarkable. At least I think so. At the risk of hyperbole, I might even call it revelatory. Quote, "We had the providential good fortune, a blessing denied to the Roman Catholics, that our prayer book was compiled at the ideal historical moment. That is to say, when the English language was already in all essentials the language we use now. Nobody has any difficulty understanding Shakespeare's or Cranmer's English as they have difficulty with Beowulf or Chaucer. At the same time, men in the 16th and 17th centuries still possessed what our own has almost totally lost, a sense for the ceremonial and ritual, both in life and language." Close quote. To douse a bit of cold water on these special words by Auden, I have read the Coverdale Psalms from the document itself, the 1540 Great Bible, and I disagree to some extent with the Auden conclusion about the easy comprehension of writings from the 16th century. At least in terms of Coverdale, without a crib of some sort. Cranmer is one thing, Coverdale another, with all its symbols and shorthand language. In correspondence to Gilbert, Auden lays out his views on what should be done with the retranslation. As a general thesis, be tender to Coverdale, and less is more. For example, Coverdale should be changed only when there is a literal mistranslation. If the word for tomato is translated by Coverdale as pomegranate, then it should be changed. In Psalm 75, verse 6a, the word judgment was correct. Promotion, the word used by Coverdale, wasn't. That was the approach Auden had in mind. But the most controversial position that Auden took dealt with Coverdale's elaborations. These were times when Coverdale simply added language and concepts, probably to fit with his more decorative style, even when the underlying original words didn't support what he did. I'll give an example. In Psalm 90, verse 11b, our retranslation, "Who rightly fears your indignation." Just to check us, you could look at the Jewish Publication Society's recent version, "Who can know your furious anger?" But here is Coverdale, "For even thereafter, as a man feareth, so is thy displeasure." The meaning is different, of course. Coverdale simply added words and concepts through elaboration. Auden didn't seem to mind that. The committee did, and most other modern translations did too. Another example, Psalm 74, verse 5a, our version. "They were like men coming up with axes to a grove of trees." Coverdale, "He that hewed timber afore out of the thick trees was known to bring it to an excellent work." Altered meaning. Auden and the committee differed on some fundamental issues, but it was a matter of degree, not in absolutes. The committee wished to maintain Coverdale as much as it could legitimately do so. Gilbert would later write, quote, "A revision in the spirit of Coverdale was the guiding principle of the committee, whether in the removal of obsolete and archaic words and expressions or in the emendation of manifestly inaccurate renderings or forms. Dr. Marion Hatchett, the Episcopal liturgist and writer, went so far as to say in his recent commentary on the American Prayer Book that our version of the Psalter, quote, is limited for the most part to that used by Coverdale in the 16th century, close quote. Auden probably would have disagreed with that characterization, and the committee may have disagreed with it as well, but for entirely different reasons. Auden served as a member of the committee from 1968 until 1971, at which point he made the decision to return to England. Auden lived only a little over a year after leaving New York City. I was appointed to replace him in 1971, but we exchanged correspondence about the retranslation project. Mostly his letters were perfunctory. However, soon after my appointment, the Poetry Center at the 92nd Street Y in the spring of that year asked if I could put a program together on the status of our retranslation. In turn, I sent a notice to all committee members about the event. Auden responded he couldn't make it, but added a rather strong message that he was so disturbed by the revisions to the Book of Common Prayer that he was now forced to attend a Russian Orthodox church. A few weeks later, I received another letter from W.H. Auden, which I learned was his last communication to the committee, his valediction, as it were. I often wondered why he chose to send it to me, but I've determined he had two reasons. One, he surmised I would be on the committee until the Psalter retranslation was complete. He was correct. Second, since I was at that time by far the youngest on the committee, he thought I would be around the longest, so his views about the revision of the Book of Common Prayer could be known in the future. In this letter, Auden expends only a few words on the Psalms. The letter consists of several paragraphs. Still, you should hear its entirety. His reference to the rite, R-I-T-E, meant the Eucharist, the communion. Dear Mr. Johnson, thank you for your letter. What has happened over the last few years has made me realize that those who rioted when Cranmer introduced a vernacular liturgy were right. When this reform nonsense started, what we should have done is the exact opposite of the Roman Catholics. We should have said, henceforth, we will have the Book of Common Prayer in Latin. There happens to be an excellent translation. In my view, the rite, preaching, of course, is another matter, is the link between the dead and the unborn. This calls for a timeless language, which in practice means a dead language. My own parish church has gone so crazy that I have to go to the Russian Orthodox Church, where, thank God, though I know what is going on, I don't understand a single word. The odd thing about the liturgical reform movement is that it is not asked for by the laity. They dislike it. It is a fad of a few crazy priests. If they imagine that their hijinks will bring youth into the churches, they are very much mistaken. As for the Psalms, they are poems, and to get poetry, it should, of course, be read in the language in which it was written. I myself, alas, know no Hebrew. All I know is that Coverdale reads like poetry and the modern versions don't. Lastly, I don't believe there is such an animal as 20th century man. With best wishes, yours sincerely, W.H. Auden. I'd like to underscore the final full sentence. Lastly, I don't believe there is such an animal as 20th century man. We'll get back to that momentarily. There's a whole chapter in my book on this letter. I discuss the language and concepts he borrowed from the English writer Charles Williams, who was theologically a major influence on Auden, whom Auden called one of only two saints he had ever known. I also describe in that chapter the fact that Thomas Cranmer, as a Reformationist, would have disagreed with Auden about both the return to Latin and the participatory role of the dead at communion. We don't have time to focus on those issues, but if you acquire the book, I believe this letter of July the 6th, 1971, will be something upon which you will wish to spend a little time. If you are interested in Auden's specific contributions to the retranslations, here are the places to look. In Psalm 27, Auden substituted secrecy for secret places. In Psalm 42, Auden changed Coverdale's water pipes to cataracts. And in Psalm 95, he replaced prepared with molded. Of course, he argued sharply for the retention of much inherited language. I'm aware Auden fought for the preservation of this line from Psalm 122. Jerusalem is built as a city that is at unity in itself. With only one minor prepositional amendment, that is precisely the way the line now reads in the current Book of Common Prayer. There were other similar victories for him, no doubt. We'll return to Auden one last time shortly. Now I'd like to turn for a moment away from him and talk briefly about the work of the committee. The composition of the committee ranged from time to time between 7 and 9 members. There were several Old Testament scholars with considerable knowledge of the underlying languages, Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. Auden and I never attended the same sessions. The project lasted nearly 12 years, with Auden being the poet for 3 and my tenure as poet lasting 8 years. When I first became a member at the age of 26, some 20 years younger than the next youngest member, I felt a little like a mascot. But then I quickly did something Auden hadn't done. I developed a compilation, a spreadsheet, if you will, on the ways that certain recent and respected translations, I chose about 8 versions, had rendered the lines for Psalms we were reviewing. I believe the compilation or spreadsheet sensitized members to the various poetic possibilities for each line of the Psalms. In a citation from the Standing Liturgical Commission of the Episcopal Church that I received in 1979 for my role on the committee, this was an area given specific note in addition to my poetic contributions. For the advertisement of Auden, the Psalms, and me, Church Publishing refers to the 1979 Episcopal Psalms as a standard, primarily as a result of the acceptance of our psalm, the Psalms that have been primarily as a result of the acceptance our Psalms have received. Soon after we completed our work, Lutherans in the United States and Canada and the Anglican Church of Canada adopted our Psalms for their service and worship books. The Church of England also adopted our Episcopal Psalter as the preferred psalm translation until the C of E produced its own retranslated version in 2000. One can debate whether the Episcopal Psalms have become a standard or not, but upon reflection, I don't think any of our revised verses have come back to bite us, unlike some other translations. For example, there's one line in Psalm 50 from a recent version I'm sure the translators have wished on more than one occasion to recall. We rendered the line as, "I will take no bull calf from your stalls," innocent enough. However, the other well-known Bible, which apparently paid less attention to vernacular speech, translates the same line as, "I will accept no bull from your house." In current everyday speech, the latter rendition is hardly the meaning. Clergy and lay folks have occasionally asked me to recite for them the principles that the drafting committee followed. Here are some of the more salient. If phrases or words were mistranslated or obsolete, there would be a change. Contemporary second-person pronoun forms were used, even when addressing God. O as cohortative, such as, "O come, let us worship," was considered obsolete. We also decided to print the Psalter as poetry. One final point. The committee determined early it wouldn't just look at the Hebrew to English and determine whether Coverdale got it right or not. There was an effort to track the way we received the text. Were there mistranslations along the way from Hebrew to Greek, or mistranslations from the Septuagint into St. Jerome to make a conclusion how those translations or retranslations had impacted the received text? After all, we Anglicans and Episcopalians had received the Psalms through a circuitous route, and that journey should be considered. In conclusion, when W.H. Auden penned to me the message, "I don't believe there is such an animal as 20th century man," I initially thought of it as a throwaway line in the context of the letter he had written. Later, I realized upon rereading and giving his comments further thought and amplification that the words had in fact summarized emphatically both his literary and theological views about a critical issue. The original psalmist, Coverdale, Auden, and the committee all shared a commonality that could not meaningfully be disrupted. For the words of the psalmist and their thoughts, pains, and humanity conveyed the aspirations, personal disappointments, happiness, and unhappiness of Coverdale and Auden, all of us who happen to be walking around at various points along the continuum of time. We are somehow the same, regardless of the moment in which we find ourselves alive, which may range from the hell of the Holocaust to convivial peace passing our way from hour to hour. Through the seeming simulacrum of a cute throwaway line, Auden had, however, found in the Eucharist the dead and the unborn linked, and found in Latin a language of the dead, but also of the faithful, and where he chose to plumb the depths of the immutable, unchallenged question of time and eternity in his Christmas oratorio for the time being. In an ironic way, the final product of the committee fulfilled the proposition Auden broached. We took the words of poems written some 2,500 to 3,000 years ago, collected them, unchanged in personality or character, dressed them in a modern and postmodern garb, and had them sing in the lilts and sonorities we inherited from the 16th century of Miles Coverdale, our traversing and coalescing a sort of timelessness where Auden meets the poets of the Psalms and all voices convene in a timeless engagement. Whether he knew it or not, the Episcopal Psalter did become, in its final form and edification, a sort of unambiguous and tailored homage to Auden's credo that I don't believe there's such an animal as 20th century man. Thank you. This is yours. May I take some questions?
Marion. Chester, can you, since I don't know anything about Coverdale, why was he asked to be respected? I guess I need to know more about the context of that time and how he came to that project in the first place, as to why he seemed to be revered, even though there were inaccuracies and additions that were,
Well, okay, I'll run through it. But Coverdale started out.
Chester, I think we're recording. Why don't you?
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry about that. Coverdale worked with Tyndall, who, the person who put out the earliest English Bible, and he worked through, and then Tyndall was killed, was burned at the stake, and then Coverdale carried on the work, and his goal was to translate into a vernacular Bible into English. Coverdale was also, there's no question, was a poet. And in 1535, he produced his first great, it wasn't called a great, his first Bible. Then between 1535 and 1540, but he was particularly interested and noted for his work in the Psalms. But there were a lot of, those Psalms just do not compare with the Psalms of his 1540. A person by the name of Sebastian Munster put out another version in Latin, and and Coverdale was very facile in Latin, Greek, and German. And so he relied very heavily on Munster's version to redo his Psalms of 1535 that came out in the Great Bible of 1540. That Bible was required because Cranmer was the archbishop at that time. Henry VIII had his problems and created the Church of England, and Cranmer was the archbishop. Cranmer required all the parishes to have the 1540 Bible on the premises. Very few people could read it, but they could see it. So although the priest would have to read from it. Then King James Version came along. Oh, and by the way, 1540, that was when the first Book of Common Prayer was compiled by Cranmer in 1549. He incorporated, by reference, but he incorporated Coverdale's Psalms contained in the 1540 Bible. Then the King James Version was translated in 1611. And basically, there's a great book on this called God's Secretaries. Basically, they used Coverdale because by that time the Psalms were so loved from the 1540 that they decided that it would be controversial for them to get largely away from those Psalms. So there were some changes, but they used the basis was Coverdale's Psalms. Then 1662, there was a codification into it wasn't new, but it was a newly formatted Book of Common Prayer, and that version, 1662, was carried through all the way